Okay. Hello, everyone. Books with Thanks back again. I'm so happy to be hanging out with my good friend, the Critical Dragon. How are you today?
I'm doing very well. And as you can see, we're using my recording stuff with my background instead of your actual bookshelves.
Yeah, but this is nice. You actually have a desk. I have to do a stack of books on like a little table behind a couch, and it's really cramped.
And Alex is being very kind because he's not mentioning the massive stuff that's surrounding us that is hidden off camera.
Um, but yeah, thank you all for joining us today. I thought it would be fun for us to have a conversation about genre. Please, if you enjoy the chat, leave a like, subscribe if you haven't already. But yeah, we've been talking a bit already today about genre and fantasy and all sorts of things. So we figured we'd move it over to this recording format too, just to share.
But well, okay, so we want to talk about genre. So the first thing to establish is what do you mean by genre?
So when I say genre and when I'm talking about it with whomever, typically I assume everyone is talking about a categorization within prose. So not the whole prose poetry, not that kind of
So
level of the
not
breakdown.
not literary genre, because
Right,
of
right.
course when we study literature, you study the genres of literature,
Right.
which are traditionally poetry, prose, and drama.
Right.
Those are the genres. But that's not what we mean anymore, is it?
No, no. Now we mean romance and fantasy and sci-fi and yeah.
Science, either SF or science
Science
fiction,
fiction, okay.
never sci-fi.
Sci-fi.
Oh,
What about cli-fi for climate fiction? No? I'll just leave. I'll just
it was something that was drilled into me when I was studying science fiction was you never called it sci-fi. You called it either science fiction or SF. Um, and I suppose part of that, when we're talking about genres, now we sort of moved into what most people use in terms of genre, which is talking about these sort of commercial genres, ways of categorizing books so that we can find, or categorizing narratives, we should say, because it applies to films, it applies to TV shows. It's a way of categorizing like with like. And you've been studying fantasy literature and some of the different theories. And we talked a little bit about Brian Atterbury's Strategies of Fantasy,
Mhm.
where he talks about the fuzzy set. And again, identifying a key text or a core text, then things that are like it, we build around it in a set. So when we talk about genre, and this this is kind of where I think our modern conception sometimes blinds us. Genre is descriptive of like with like. It is a grouping of similar things. It is not prescriptive. So we have genre as a commercial label that helps us find things. We have genre that is descriptive of like with like. Um, and we have genre obviously as the literary genres. So how are you defining fantasy?
So, I tend to favor extremely broad definitions, especially when just having conversations with friends and family and whatnot, where fantasy, my knee-jerk reaction is to say anything that's non-mimetic, anything that happens in the world in the story that couldn't happen in our real world or with our sense of observable, like scientific reality. That's my knee-jerk reaction.
Well, hang on a second. Before we move on from that, because
Yeah.
I think it's a good place to start. What do you mean by mimetic? Because you just threw out a word.
Right, right, right. So, by mimetic, I mean fiction or some kind of story that I guess is trying to be as representative of the real world as possible, and that doesn't throw in what I would say are fantastic elements. Yeah.
So, but broadly speaking, when we talk about mimetic or mimesis, it's this copying, a mirror to.
Mhm.
It is mimicking.
Mhm.
There's the same etymological root,
Right.
mimicking. So very, very similar to. So if we think of, say, something like the Dresden Files, Butcher's Dresden Files, the setting of Chicago, uh, except for Chicago natives who may dispute how accurate Butcher's depiction of Chicago was in the initial few books. But it was trying to be representative of Chicago in that time and period and location to evoke a sense of the real Chicago. But obviously, it isn't the real Chicago. It is a mimicry. It is similar to the real Chicago, but it isn't actually Chicago. But then you were talking about non-mimetic elements, which we could see as those fantastic elements, the magic, the monsters, the fairy, the fae, the werewolves, all those supernatural elements which do not exist, therefore are non-mimetic. Would that be a fair way to sort of articulate this?
Yeah, that's the sort of the background behind that knee-jerk reaction again.
And one of the key texts about this is Catherine Hume's Fantasy and Mimesis. Again, where she's investigating that distinction between what the fantastic is doing. And I'm using fantastic here as a broader sort of supergenre. So if we talk about, there's a distinction between fantasy and science fiction. Would you say that's fair to say?
Yes, yeah. And horror.
And horror.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so fantasy, science fiction, and horror. They're not the same. Now, these are not concrete categories. They're not boxes that if it is in horror, it can never have any of the other elements. What we're talking about are core values, like Adabri had suggested with the fuzzy set, that there seem to be elements that draw it into a certain categorization, but it can still have overlap. We think of Venn diagrams doing this sort of thing. But if we think of fantasy, science fiction, and horror, these all in some way quite often, well, actually, I shouldn't say all, these quite often diverge from that mimetic reality. And that divergence into the supernatural, into the magical, into the technological that doesn't exist, weird and wonderful inventions. That divergence is setting it apart from, say, something that is literally set in as close to this world as we can.
Mm-hmm.
And it is a distinction between, say, Oliver Twist and A Christmas Carol.
Right.
Oliver Twist, there aren't supernatural elements, there aren't fantasy elements, there aren't, well, you talk about psychological horror.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
It's not a horror text. Whereas A Christmas Carol, again, very, very similar setting in that it's the same rough period of London, but we have supernatural entities that are part and parcel of this story world. So we could say that, yeah, they're both by Dickens. Yeah, they're both set in London in this rough time period. Mm-hmm. It's an evocation of London from a certain perspective or point of view, but they would be in different genres. Unless, of course, our genre was Victorian literature.
Right. Yeah, so yeah, I guess any conversation about genre it requires, especially the more kind of serious your audience is, it requires so much explanation up front about exactly so much defining of terms, which is what we spend so much time doing. But yeah.
And who doesn't love a good semantic argument?
Right.
But the purpose of this is, and as you said at the beginning, when we are talking to our friends, we have a term that we will use, a general sense of it. And because they're our friends, because we've had conversations with them before, it's the, well, you know what I mean. But as soon as we're talking to other people, like we're recording a video, we have no idea of the background of anyone watching this video. So we don't know what their definition of, say, fantasy is, how they think about it. And they might not know how we're thinking about it. So although we're using the same term, and there may even be a significant overlap in what we are conceptualizing with that term, it's not to say that it's going to be the same. Because when you had said something that was non-mimetic, and I went, well, okay, that's the fantastic, because that is science fiction, fantasy, and horror. Fantasy is not necessarily the same as the fantastic, because fantasy is a particular genre. But where do, say, like superheroes fit in?
Right. And well, yeah, so superheroes are strange, and I think
Well, that's just because of what they wear.
right, right. But I think especially when I was growing up, I would always sort of think, oh, more DC superheroes are have more fantasy elements going on with them, and more Marvel heroes have more science fiction because of like with DC uh, character like
Dr. Fate,
right, yeah, sure, sure, sure.
Zatanna.
Yeah, yeah, sure. And then with Marvel, there's a lot of a lab accident or something went wrong, and you know, Peter Parker gets bitten by a radioactive spider, and even a term like radioactive sort of connotes some kind of scientific thinking process anyway. Um, yeah.
But when we get down to it, A, they are set not in this world
Right.
because, Metropolis and Gotham, or in the Marvel universe, Madripoor, where
Mhm.
Wolverine used to hang out and hide. But these aren't real places. So it's not mimetic. And you have the whole issue about superhero aging.
Right, right. Yeah.
But ignoring that for a second.
Oh, I'd love to come back to that though with a specific thing. Sorry.
But when we think about it, say the X-Men, there's this pseudoscientific explanation for why the X-Men have powers. Oh, their genetics have changed. They have
Right,
mutated.
right.
And you go, what biological function allows all of your cells to become frozen and yet still mobile? Or all of what biological function, how can you change someone's genetics that they become an organic steel?
Right, right.
That it's pseudoscientific. It is a fig leaf to put over it as a hand wavy explanation in much the same way in Star Trek. Oh, it's the deflector shield and the boson extractor
Uh,
flurble.
uh,
It's a pseudoscientific to a hand wave to go, there is some sort of explanation. That's not the important thing. The important thing is the actual narrative, the story, or what they're doing with it. And so that's when it moves into looking at, say, superheroes as examples of power and abuse of power, or looking at societal issues through the lens of using this quite colorful escape from an in-depth exploration of the real world. And that's something we see in science fiction, fantasy, and horror. So I find it fascinating because if we think about how we're using genre, we can think about it a number of ways. And one of the ones that we were talking about earlier was Farah Mendelssohn's breakdown of fantasy. And she talks in a book called Rhetorics of Fantasy. She talks about the portal quest as a type of fantasy, the intrusion fantasy, the immersive fantasy, and then the liminal fantasy. Now, she's at pains to say that these are not concrete be all and end all, but she identifies these four sort of things. But even within that, if we think about um, Portal Quest, immersion, and intrusion. And again, I'll use the Dresden Files as an example. The first couple of Dresden Files books, we have Harry, and he's living in the real world. And a lot of the emphasis in the first couple of books, a lot of the focus of the first couple of books is a supernatural or magical threat is threatening the real world. And Harry is defending the real world against it. And at the end of the novel, he has defeated the threat, and essentially the world sort of reverts to normal and people don't know about this mystical magical
right,
world. So that's kind of what Mendelson was talking about in terms of the intrusion fantasy. But as we move along in the series, there's less and less about, oh, well, this is a magical threat to the world, and more it becomes immersive, almost in a secondary world of magic, where magic is the default norm. And the secondary world, or sorry, the mundane world is almost a minor element, that it's not really, it's more about magical forces versus magical forces. It's not about, oh, we're worried about this intruding into the real world and the real world finding out about magic. That it moves away from the impetus of intrusion, what this magic is doing or this threat is doing, and it becomes more immersive. And the most common element, or the most common form of immersive fantasy that I think a lot of people would be familiar with, would be secondary world fantasies. This is the default world. Magic exists in this world. And so to bring it back to the Dresden Files, in the later books, how many of the characters in the later books are magical characters? And you go,
Right.
significantly more than in the first couple of books, where it's there are quite a few mundane characters and there's the occasional magical. It shifts entirely almost to a secondary world. So it becomes more immersive. And then the last one I want to talk about, Portal Quest. So the idea of a portal, a classic example would be the Chronicles of Narnia. There's the wardrobe. You walk through the wardrobe, you've gone through a portal, you emerge at the other side, and you're in a fantasy world. So the mundane world exists and the fantasy world exists. And there's a portal that you use to get between the two. You cross this threshold, very similar to Stargate SG-1.
Mm-hmm.
Here's the Stargate. We're in the normal world. We go through the Stargate, suddenly we're in an alien world. Or even in science fiction like Star Trek. Go, here we are floating around in our spaceship. We enter warp drive and we emerge in an alien reality. In each of these, it goes from being a very obvious portal that you move through to this idea of crossing a threshold to encounter the alien. And that's, I think, part of the reason why Mendelson paired it with the quest narrative, where you start off with the young hero, not knowing they're a young hero, and they're in a small village and it's a rural thing. And then a magic user shows up and goes, I'm going to send you on a quest and we're going to go on this quest. So they leave the mundane, comfortable reality of their small town existence and they cross the threshold of the village into the broader, wider world that's full of danger and adventure and excitement. Excitement, adventure. A Jedi craves not these things. But they then go on a quest. And interestingly, although so many people point at Tolkien for the quest narratives, A, Tolkien didn't invent quest narratives. B, Tolkien's quest was to get rid of an object. And the vast majority of quest narratives that I think we have in the established sort of fantasy genre are acquisition, token acquisition. Find the object of power, find the magical sword, find the magical artifact, find the thing that's going to help us defeat. So it's all about finding the thing in order to use it. Whereas Tolkien is almost the anti-quest because it's, we have the thing, we need to get rid of the thing. Yeah. It's the quest to get rid of it. So it's, weirdly enough, a very different sort of approach to what the object is. It's not about collecting the plot coupon, it's about getting rid of the plot coupon. But you can see, even with these categorizations, you can easily have a mundane reality, a hero in a little village where it's a secondary world, so it's immersive. Mm-hmm. And yet there's a crossing of dangerous magic into this world. This is the opening of Wizard's First Rule by Terry Goodkind.
Yeah, Goodkind. Yeah. I was about to say Terry Brooks, but that's fine.
You have Richard lives in this quite mundane reality, and suddenly magic is crossing the barrier. So we have intrusion, but he's the sort of the callow youth who's going to go on this magical adventure, and he crosses the barrier into the magical world. So it's Portal Quest, and suddenly that's the default reality. So it's immersion, and it's all part of a secondary world in the first place. So we can see how these different narrative elements, one about the direction of the narrative, the arc of the narrative, the idea of the plot, the Portal Quest. Right. That's a narrative arc. But the idea of intrusion is about the impact of the supernatural or the impact of the magical on the mundane reality. And then with immersive, it's about the establishment of a base norm that is distinct from a mundane reality. Mm-hmm. And yet, I've just highlighted a text that's doing all three.
Right.
So when we think about genre, for me, a lot of the time, genre is a way to have a handy shorthand to describe something. And it's a way of highlighting different elements. But genre, because for me, genre is always descriptive. The definition of any given genre is not fixed. It will change as genres change.
Right.
So as the genre changes, the definition of the genre changes.
Right.
which is a bit weird. But we can maybe talk about that in a minute.
So yeah, I like kind of what you were saying there with the shorthand. I think a fun way or a useful way to think about genre is, let's say you're about to get up and give a presentation, or this is a way that I like to think about it. And my presentation is about Lord of the Rings, maybe. And I say, I'm going to analyze Lord of the Rings, but as science fiction or as a specific type of fantasy or something like that. Then everyone in the audience might all of a sudden have to rework their assumptions about what I'm about to talk about. And it's never to say this is the only genre that this work could fit in. It's just for the purposes of this conversation, this moment, presentation, whatever. These are the sorts of expectations and assumptions that I'm using the term SF or science fiction, so that you're all on this at least some kind of similar page that I'm on before I jump into the other part of the presentation.
And the classic example of this is Star Wars: A New Hope.
Mhm.
Because if we ignore for a moment the dressing of the story world, we have a young boy in a rural agricultural community. He's a farm boy. He gets a magic sword. He has the wise mentor figure who has magical powers. They then meet up with a barbarian and a
Mhm.
roguish thief, and they go on a journey to rescue a princess from a Dark Lord. They then gather their forces and they take down the Dark Lord's forces. That is fairy tale or fantasy, like overtly. And yet it has spaceships and lasers and the traveling between alien worlds, and it has robots. And these are science fiction. So we could say, oh, well, it's sci fantasy or science fiction fantasy or science fantasy. And we're saying it's a mixture of the two things. But in terms of the narrative beats, in terms of that narrative structure and not formula, but patterning, those elements, those tropes are fairy tale and fantasy tropes, but they have been evoked in a science fiction setting and a science fictional story world. And Lucas clearly intended this because, of course, the opening crawl, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, is an evocation of that starting of a fairy tale. So we know it's playing with those two different things. But if we were looking at it just from a surface level, it has spaceships, it has aliens, it has lasers. This is science fiction. It's not fantasy. And the force isn't magic. It's an energy force that, and suddenly
Right.
there's this pseudoscientific explanation for things. And, and again, part of it sometimes will boil down to preconceptions or even prejudices that people have about certain genres. That science fiction is in some way more intellectual than fantasy, or that fantasy in some way is more infantile than science fiction. People have these sorts of preferences, and that's fine. But as soon as we start mapping that on as a prescriptive notion about what the thing is, we are doing disservice to the text, because just like Atterbury did with the fuzzy set and the strategies of fantasy approach, was look at the text, see what the text is evoking, and what the text then connects to. Because genre is not an external force that is applied on things. Genre is a grouping of elements, and therefore we have to look at the elements to see what their similarities and commonalities are, because from that emerges the genre, at least to my mind.
Uh, the question about a specific series. I've just started reading Stephen R. Donaldson's Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, and that's in most conversations I think that I'd have about fantasy, about the series, people would use the term portal fantasy to describe that story. And I'm curious what your
But
interpretation is.
one of the weird things about that is Tolkien's world, it isn't a secondary world. It has much more in common with Hard's Hyborian Age, a forgotten mythic history of
Right,
Earth,
right.
than it does a secondary world. When we think of Thomas Covenant, yeah, you could say, oh, well, he goes through this uh, transference to the magical the land in much the same way that in John Carter of Mars. You know, he goes into the cave and there's the vapors, and suddenly he's on Mars. He's traveled to Mars, a different place. But when we talk about the portal quest, that's not really what Donaldson
Right.
is investigating. So to describe it as a portal quest, is it similar to, um, say, the Chronicles of Narnia? You go, no, the Chronicles of Narnia is children's fantasy,
Right. And it's
and
definitely not that.
and it's not that. It's radically different. What is a lot of what Donaldson is playing with, at least I think, is this literalization of the internal psychology of characters into this manifestation of the fantasy world. That it's a way of looking at the struggles within our minds, our souls, our consciousness, and evoking them into a literal physical reality and then exploring those conflicts. So, and almost an articulation of the conflict of, what is it, the heart in conflict with itself.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
That Donaldson is exploring these psychological realities. And one of the ways to go through that is creating a physical manifestation. So it's not a mystical portal in the same way that the Chronicles of Narnia is. It's closer to a prologue to actually an immersive fantasy, because
Right.
you have a character who is rejecting the nature of the immersive reality.
Yeah.
So it's focused on whether or not immersion and mimesis is going to exist for that fantasy reality, and the struggles of trying to come to terms with a world that is not conforming to your worldview. And again, we think about these books, these narratives in different ways, because what we're picking up on. If I said, right, you have a wise mentor figure, and you might think of Gandalf,
Right.
and then you look at Dumbledore, and you go, well, that's almost a carbon copy of Gandalf. Like, it's very hard to get around that.
Yeah.
But then you look at Maureen from Wheel of Time. And yeah, she's the wise mentor figure, but she's not the wise old aged mentor that we maybe associate with the Jungian archetype. But she's forming initially the same plot function. And she is a powerful mage. She knows more than the heroes. She gathers the group together. She acts as a guide and a mentor and manipulator.
Yeah.
And Dumbledore, he manipulated the kids all the time.
Yeah.
And Gandalf even manipulates. Think of what he does to Bilbo
Right.
and how he gets Bilbo on the quest in
Right.
the first place. That we can look at what they look like and what they physically embody, or we can look at the function and role they are playing within the narrative. And suddenly we're saying that there can be these major distinctions between them, and we're looking more at role. But that's not the only way. And we sometimes shift between these two things. Remember, we were talking about Westerns and Reacher.
Right.
So I don't know if people are familiar with the Jack Reacher books and the Jack Reacher TV show. But if you describe to someone, there's a drifter comes into a small town. He discovers that there's a corrupt sheriff and a corrupt landowner. And he gathers a small team to put right the wrongs and take down this corruption. That is readily identifiable as a central element of the Western. But Reacher is a military police investigator. He's an investigator in the modern world. He's not in Arizona or Nevada or Texas. He's not out in the desert. He doesn't wear a cowboy hat. He doesn't carry around a six-shooter and have a quick draw. But so much of the narrative patterning is that of the Western. Even though the evocation of it and the surface level presentation of it is different, it looks a lot, sounds a lot, and feels a lot like the patterning of a Western. But if you said to someone, oh, Reacher, the Western, we immediately feel a knee-jerk rejection to that, because he's not a cowboy. He's not wearing cowboy boots. It's not that story. And yet when we look at that sort of structural level, we can see the similarities. So someone who really enjoys Westerns might really enjoy Reacher.
Yeah.
Um, and yet, is it a Western?
Uh, Based on the argument you just laid out, I think absolutely, yeah. Yeah. Um, yes, yeah. Mandalorian is a Western as well. We talked about that a little bit too. Um, yeah, and it's a Western, and I also think conversations around genre, a lot of times, maybe online in certain spaces, people treat genre as sort of territories, and like someone is, if someone is denying that a certain work could be uh, fantasy, then it's like they're not allowing that into this realm, or vice versa. Or sometimes if we say like like Reacher is a Western, then Western fans might say, wait, what's we don't want anything to do with Reacher. What like why are you letting that work
Because
come enter our genre?
Because if I asked you, what are the key aspects of a Western? And you might say, oh, it's the cowboy hat. It's the
Right.
Sergei Leone, the big, giant,
Right.
panoramic view
Horse riding,
of the desert.
basically.
It's the horses. It's the guns. It's the having the old style wooden buildings and
Uh,
um, the gambling in the corner.
the
Like
music, the yeah.
that it's a period piece set in that piece of mythic Americana. Those are all the elements of the Western. And yet, when I was describing Reacher, I was describing a narrative pattern which we find in the Western. So, is the narrative pattern what a Western is, or is it the accoutrement, the expression, the surface level appearance? And that's why we started talking about Star Wars, because is it the narrative patterning, which is clearly sort of fairy tale and fantasy, or is it science fiction because it looks like science fiction?
It's the aesthetic versus the structure. Yeah. That that divide, yeah.
And this is the thing that I find most fascinating about genre. Because yeah, you're absolutely right. We can get very territorial
Oh,
about
yeah.
it.
Don't let the romantasy or
I know,
that's not, but that's a big fantasy, epic fantasy
I
reaction, I think.
I know, but I have, and I hate to admit this, on occasion said, I wish they would stop getting their science fiction all over my fantasy.
Yeah, sure.
Because I remember there was a series of books by an author called James Eng, and in it, Ambrosius, I think it's Ambrosius Morlock is the character, but the magic within these worlds that he travels to is expressed in very science fictional terms. He tessellated the fourth dimensional through like
Okay.
that's how the magic's being described because it's an advanced form of science. So any technology that's sufficiently advanced is indistinguishable from magic.
Mhm.
And he plays with that. But the rest of the world is described and rendered in fantasy language. And then you have this very sharp, metallic, scientific language being used to describe the actual magic. And I'm like, stop getting your science fiction over my fantasy. Why not use the same like? And again, but the magic he's using is alien, and it's this imposition. And when we think quite often, actually not quite often, sometimes when people use magic, it is this unnatural force that is upsetting the natural order. But in other fantasy series, magic is part and parcel of the natural world. It's an extension of the rules of that reality, the laws of that reality. It's an additional force up there with gravity and magnetism
Right.
and whatever. That magic is part and parcel of that reality. So that's distinct from it's an alien force that is unnatural and disrupting it. So there's two very radically different ways of treating the nature of reality and the nature of magic within that reality, where we could refer to sort of Mendelssohn's definitions again and talk about is it intrusive, this unnatural force, or is it immersive? Is it part of the pattern, the tapestry of that reality? And so you brought up romantasy
Yeah.
as, and this is one of the things that I always find so frustrating. People, go, oh, this new thing. Yeah, Shakespeare, Midsummer Night's Dream came out last year. Um, Romance as a genre romance as a narrative pattern has been around for a while.
Right.
Romance within fantasy or fantasy explorations of it has been around for a while. And one of my favorite examples of it is when you look at Laurel K. Hamilton's Anita Blake series. It starts like very much urban, what is now sort of urban fantasy, but it's romance. And then it's urban fantasy erotica.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
it go. But when we think of Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire, that's horror romance.
Right.
And then The Vampire Lestat is a much more standard, almost fantasy novel. And then you have Queen of the Damned, where it's almost urban fantasy horror. That we start using these terms because the term encapsulates a bunch of different connotations and a bunch of different tropes that we're packaging together and go, if you want to know what this thing is, it has some of this and some of this. We're using it to describe. And that's where I think the usefulness of genre is in informal discussion and even informal discussion, that it's a shorthand for things. But we, when we are using it, need to be aware
Right.
of what we are bundling because these are not set in stone. And romantasy being codified as a subgenre of general fantasy. You're like, that's absolutely fine. There are movements and trends in every single genre. Look at the importance of hard SF and the importance of gadgeteer stories in early science fiction. But then the movement toward more soft SF and changes from that, where hard SF, it's not that it's disappeared, it's not that people aren't writing it anymore, but it doesn't necessarily have the same prominence within the commercial genre.
Mm-hmm.
But it's still there, people are still writing it. And it's not that other things have stopped it being written, it's other things have become more popular. And genres are a definition or a way of expressing what the genre is currently doing.
Right.
And romantasy has existed for as long as fantasy has existed, which as a commercial genre, you know, you're talking about the 1960s, early 70s. But before that, we have the fantastic tales. Look at Oedipus, a tragic romance involving gods and,
Right,
and
right.
fate, or the Odyssey. There are his faithful wife Penelope waiting for him at the
Right,
end.
right.
But the idea of romantasy as a new thing, it might be a newly codified term, but that doesn't make it a new thing. And it might be rising in popularity, and you're like, okay, but it's still just as fantasy as any other definition
Right.
of fantasy.
Yeah.
Epic fantasy. Epic fantasy rose in prominence. Maybe it's had its heyday. Maybe it's sinking down and becoming less popular. Okay. But that doesn't mean the fantasy genre is dying. Just as their sword and sorcery and planetary romance, huge and popular in the early pulps. But now sword and sorcery and planetary romance, not necessarily as popular. But we still have those elements. It's still part of the tradition and it still feeds into the things that are being written. And you might say, oh, well, I don't like this new romantasy stuff.
Right.
Get off my lawn. I want dragons and swords. Right. Well, okay. But that doesn't make it any less valid. It doesn't make it any less fantasy. And it doesn't make it any less an expression of something within the genre.
Right. Right. Yeah, I totally agree. Now, a question for you. What what would you say about authors after maybe a book that they wrote has been out for a year? Everyone's been talking about it in terms of one genre. Barnes and Noble has it in one place for that year. But then after that year's up, the author is fed up and says, no, this is not whatever genre. This I intended this to be a different genre.
Well, okay. Now we're getting into death of the author.
Right,
Right?
yeah.
So the author's intent may be it's meant to be X. Okay. But if lots of people are reading it as Y, and that's how they're finding it, that's how other people who want to read that sort of thing are going to be finding it, then you can go, well, it's also Y. That doesn't invalidate the author's position that they intended it to be X and that X is a valid way to look at it. But it does mean that you can have this alternate definition or categorization as Y. So um, we saw that with Margaret Atwood when she wrote The Handmaid's Tale.
Right.
And she said, this isn't science fiction, it's speculative fiction. And this is one of the bugbears that I have, because there seems to be this whole thing that speculative fiction is in some way not as genreified as science fiction. And Atwood, she, whether as a marketing thing or whether she genuinely believed it, I don't know. I don't know her personally. I've never spoken to her about it. But at the time, she had said that science fiction was all spaceships and lasers, and she was quite dismissive.
Yeah.
And she may have been thinking of pulp SF.
Right.
She may have been thinking of adventurous science fiction. But positing a dystopic future world based on the social sciences, which is an aspect of science, it was falling into SF. It's the same way that a lot of people distinguish between, oh, that's dystopian literature, not science fiction. And you're like, because there's, again, a perception that science fiction must be this thing and science fiction cannot be serious. And anyone who has studied science fiction, the history of science fiction and science fiction theory and literature, you know that there's incredibly important works. And this idea that science fiction is mere entertainment or fantasy is mere entertainment is just flat out wrong. And it's applying a definition, a prescriptive definition, to a genre without paying attention to what's going on in the genre. And this use of speculative fiction as a term that is somehow more respectable than science fiction. Maybe it is. Maybe it's a better marketing term. It makes it sound more literary.
More sophisticated.
But, Ursula Le Guin, The Dispossessed, speculative fiction. The Left Hand of Darkness, speculative fiction. But also science fiction. What makes, we're extrapolating into the future. You're like, but that's what a lot of science fiction does. There's a novum being explored, to use Darko Suvin's sort of term for this. The change has been made. Let's look at the exploration of the ramifications of that change. That is at the heart of a lot of science fiction. So just because it doesn't have lasers and aliens and spaceships doesn't necessarily invalidate it being science fiction. Fahrenheit 451, so Bradbury, or Orwell's 1984, or Huxley's Brave New World. These things, Brave New World, science fiction, but dystopian. And it was looking at the hyper authoritarian capitalism versus individualism and playing with it, exploring it. Not to say one is better than the other, but actually exploring this concept in a way that wasn't saying, you from this country and your system, you are bad.
Right.
And because people feel that's a criticism of them. Whereas science fiction, fantasy, horror, these speculative fictions, the fantastic, quite often take these things into a non-mimetic space to explore the concepts in a way slightly removed from reality, slightly removed from that knee-jerk reaction and the need to defend our beliefs or our positions or our nation or our politics or our ideologies, that it places them in this realm so that we can explore concepts and think about them, so that when we come back, and Donaldson talked about this in one of his essays, when we return to our world from this journey into the fictive reality, we take those lessons and we can reevaluate our position in the world around us from what we have experienced, from what we have explored. And it is a safe way to do it without being judged for your current position. And that is one of the major powers of fiction, all fiction, that it has this ability. It can do this. It's why fiction, be it literature or film or TV, that, yeah, it can be created to entertain, to while away a certain time period. And you can turn off your brain and just, oh, look, power, what, blast, explosion, and yeah, this is great, Or it can be thought-provoking, or it can challenge assumptions. the range of what different films, TV shows, and books do, uh, and I include comics and graphic novels and manga and anime and all forms of narrative, the range of what they can do is almost infinite. And it's not that it has to be just one of these elements. Things can be wildly entertaining and have lots of, gosh, wow, explosion, isn't that really cool? As well as thought provoking and intellectually stimulating and challenge concepts in our reality. It can do all of these things at once. And it's why I get annoyed when people say, oh, books shouldn't be didactic. You're like, well, apart from didactic books, because if they aren't didactic, then there's something wrong. Oh, no, but stories and novels shouldn't be didactic. You're like, why not?
Yeah.
Oh, the author shouldn't let their own personal beliefs. You're like, oh, no. Oh, there shouldn't be politics in narrative. What?
Right.
What are you talking about? That it mightn't be the thing that type of politics in that type of narrative for you personally. You don't want that. But that's not the same as saying politics shouldn't be in the art. There is a very strong symbiotic link between art and politics,
yeah.
art and history, art and the world in which it is created. It is a conversation between so many of them. Do all pieces of art have to do this? No, in exactly the same way that we should never limit what an artist wants to explore, be it in narrative or in sculpture or in any of these things. And that's, oh, it just bugs me. Oh, it's fantasy. It shouldn't have politics in it. You're like, okay, well, that's a thalassocracy and there's a monarchy. Those are both political things. Oh no, but that's not what I meant. I meant like, why did the girl have to rescue the hero? Why not? Like, did it fit with the story? Was it interesting? Like, oh.
Yeah, I think a lot of times, well, first of all, when people say politics shouldn't be in X, Y, or Z, whatever, that they need to be more careful with what they mean by politics because it's such a broad term. Like you said, like if there's a political institution, then you could say something's political. But yeah, I think a lot of times people are maybe suggesting this scene in this book reminded me of a really important issue right now, and it frustrated me to encounter that in this book when I was trying to not think about whatever.
I know, but
Yeah.
we obviously have both read the Malazan Book of the Fallen by
Right,
Stephen
right,
Erickson.
right.
And in one of the books, there is a capitalist society.
Yeah.
And there's this whole exploration of capitalism. And a lot of modern readers take it as a critique of America. And yet, when we look at different elements of it, you go, but this is equally a critique and perhaps a more accurate critique of the British Empire,
Right, right.
going way back
Yeah.
in time. That's a much more accurate representation of what is happening in the novel. But if our understanding of a capitalist society and our understanding of a capitalist system is locked in our understanding of what America is, and we don't know a lot about the capitalism of the British Empire, then we go, oh, but it's clearly America because that's our understanding of it. And again, readers always create meaning in their own minds. Authors try to communicate something, but a reader has to decode it. And we can make errors in how we decode. We can make mistakes. We can misread, we can misunderstand. But even then, even if we have perfectly understood, okay, so this is a critique of capitalism of some kind, the paradigm that we might be most familiar with is not necessarily the same paradigm that the author was thinking of. So anyone stating that that particular book that Erickson wrote is a criticism of America, that statement is factually incorrect.
Right.
But if they said it's a criticism of capitalism, and we could use it
Right.
to
Critique
America's
yeah.
capitalism, that makes much more sense. And you go, oh, but you're just splitting hairs. And you go, no. One is saying that it was written to critique America, and it's not. It wasn't written to critique America. That's authorial intent. It's what the author was doing. If you understand it as this is critical of America, well, why? America isn't mentioned.
Right.
The system of government
Right.
isn't the American system of government. Nothing about it. Oh no, but it's clearly criticizing capitalism. So why did you make that link between it's criticizing capitalism and it's criticizing America? Why did you as a reader make that link? And that's where being aware of how we're understanding literature, how we're understanding genres, how we're understanding what's going on, being aware of why we make those links. That is the end goal, I think, of a lot of literary analysis, understanding that connection. Because again, it comes back to genre. Oh, it's fantasy. So fantasy dragons are. You're like, I'm sorry, what? Fantasy dragons must have. Well, that has two wings and two legs. Therefore, it is a wyvern, not a dragon. And you're like, in heraldry, that's a wyvern, not a dragon. I'm not reading heraldry. Oh no, but in other fantasy books, it's called a wyvern. Yeah, but in this book, it's called a dragon. Where is the definition that a dragon has to be hexapedal?
Right.
Well, it is in heraldry. Yeah, but this isn't heraldry. And again, part of it is our understanding, our knowledge, our concepts our background, what we have previously assimilated. But ultimately, we are looking at a fictional construct. So a dragon doesn't have to have 6 limbs. A dragon can have 2 limbs. It can be wings and a long tail, or even lots of legs, or no legs.
A giant worm, and that's all.
A wyvern. Oh, but a wyvern is like, why? Why? And it's because we take what we understand from one place and we prescriptively apply it to something else and go, it must be that. And we're all guilty of it. We all do it. We build up expectations and these concepts of genre norms. So if I did this earlier, but a roguish thief in a quest party, describe them to me.
Oh, black leather clothing, dagger, short sword, something like that. Maybe some kind of mask or head covering. Yeah.
Are they very tall?
No, they don't have to be. No, they would be smaller so they can fit into those sneaky places.
But why? Why? When we talk about these rogues and these thieves in fantasy novels, and we think of, well, they're slightly shorter stature, they're wearing leather armor, they don't have long weapons. Barbarian. What does the barbarian look like in the party?
Oh, giant, more than 6 feet tall. Maybe a club, maybe a massive sword. Maybe not wearing much armor at all. Maybe more loincloth. I don't know.
And, their headdress is like a
Right,
bear or a
right,
lion,
right.
and they're wearing furs,
Right.
and their weapon is, like, as you said, like it could be a two-handed club, or a
Right,
two-handed sword, or a two-handed axe, or a two-handed hammer.
Right,
What's with all the two-handed stuff? Why can't a barbarian have a one-handed sword and a shield?
right.
Well, that's not what a barbarian is. Well, why? When we talk about knights, what does a knight look like? We might think in terms of full plate. But you don't walk around in full
Right,
plate's
right.
designed to be, you sit on a horse. Because walking around in full plate's quite difficult. You're like, I'm going to walk through these woods in full plate. That doesn't make it. But they have the full plate. They have quite often a kite shield, and they will have their longsword, or arming sword, I suppose we should more accurately call it. But that's a perception of what the knight looks like from medieval romance.
Right.
A wizard, and you're like, we already talked about maybe the conception of the slightly older person with the white hair and the long white beard,
Staff
and a staff.
wand, yeah.
But like, are they wearing armor?
No, absolutely not.
And the thing is, we can all name texts where you have that mage or wizard character. It doesn't look like that.
Right.
Or has different. We can name texts where the thief character doesn't that. But when we say it, we have quite often these initial preconceptions. And when those preconceptions are challenged, we can react with, but that's not right. That's not how it should be done. Or we can react with, well, that's interesting. I don't know where they're going with this. Because why should the thief be short and be witty and sarcastic all the time? Um, and quite often the thief characters are not like that. But when we get challenged with it, we have this preconcept, even if it actually, if we looked at all of the books on our bookshelves and go, let's look at the thief character. Well, the thief character there isn't like that. The thief character there isn't like that. Why do I have this preconception? And this is part and parcel about understanding the tropes associated with the genre and these elements that quite often are more like stereotypes.
Yeah.
There's a grain of truth to them, but it's not the complete truth. It's an element that was based somewhere and yet is actually far from the reality. But it occurs frequently enough that we see it. And I was talking about Margaret Weis's story The Best, which is a little short story in the Dragonlance series, in the Dragonlance world. And it's one of my favorite short stories to explain genre concepts because you have the thief, the sorceress, the cleric, the warrior. You have, and they all conform to these preconceived notions of what these character types look like, how they speak, how they behave, what sort of weapons they have, what sort of armor they have. And then during the course of the short story, it's, oh, there's this thing. Let me use, oh, well, it's the sorceress is going to do this, so she's going to use a magic spell to do this thing. Oh, well, now we have this. And, is the sorceress going to fix it? No, this is the time for the thief to show their special skills. Well, what about the warrior is now going to do this and defeat this thing. And each time there's each of these incidents where that character gets a chance, like you're playing a role-playing game, to show off their special ability and skill. And they are the perfect piece to solve that puzzle. And this is in a short story. And for me, it's a wonderful way to explain this perception of genre norms, these genre stereotypes. Is it the world's greatest short story? No. Let's face it. Honestly, it's not. But it so eloquently shows us this attitude to genre, this attitude to what the genre is. And that's obviously been a preoccupation of mine for decades now.
That story sort of reminds me of, and I haven't read the book, but it reminds me of the sequence in Princess Bride, or in The Princess Bride, when the Dread Pirate Roberts has to defeat each member of the pirating crew one by one.
So the feat of strength, the dueling, and then the feat of intelligence.
Exactly. Yeah.
And each one, it's or like. If you remember it was in the 1990s, the Thundercats cartoon, and Lion-O had to prove to the other Thundercats that he could beat. So he had to beat Chitara in a race. He had to
in all of their special,
And Panthro was the strong one, so he had to beat Panthro in a feat of strength. And Tigra was the agile one, so he had to. And Wily Kitten, each one you go, no, hang on, that's their specialism. They should all be beating him,
right?
But he was the all-rounder. He could do all of these things. And you're like, okay, fine. But why does he need to be well, because he's the hero. And the hero has to be the best at everything. You're like, oh. So he maxed out all of his stats. It just annoyed me. There's no way that Lion-O should be able to beat Chitara in a race. It's just not possible.
Right.
But, and again, we think about it. So when we think of that balanced party, the quest party, and again, you see it in multiple things before this, but it becomes codified with role-playing games. It becomes popularized with role-playing games. And role-playing games then ended up in computer games. And then in the books set in and influenced by role-playing games. And then the books that were inspired by and influenced the books that were based on role-playing games. So it's this chain of influence. But, we think to the Magnificent Seven, or Kurosawa's The Seven Samurai. Again, each of them being distinct, each of them being slightly different. In a Western, the guy with the rifle, the guy with the shotgun, the guy with the six-shooter, the guy with two six-shooters, the guy who's the knife specialist. Or in the military team, and there's the sniper,
right.
There's the leader, there's the demolition expert, right. There's the medic. That each one of them has their assigned roles because it's a very flexible group. the one of the weird things is that fantasy RPGs kind of codified this. And it then became like, even if you looked at visual representations of the characters, you'd go, that's the mage,
Yeah.
that's the
Yeah.
warrior, that's the
Mhm.
thief, just by looking at the visual representation, because suddenly role and function and character became codified. And it's not that other bit, like, even if you think of the Three Musketeers,
Mhm.
Athos, Porthos, and Aramis. So you have Athos, the veteran, who's the military sort of planner and genius. You have Porthos, who's
Yeah.
the brawling strong guy. You have Aramis, the intellectual finesse.
Yeah.
And then you have D'Artagnan, who is like the idiot who turns up, but apparently is the best of all of them. But and again, they're each codified by one particular thing. And looking at it, Porthos is always much bigger, and then Athos is the weathered veteran, and then Aramis is the young, good-looking guy who's a priest. But that kind of gets looked over because he's romancing people all the time. You're like, but it's not that these things have not appeared before, but as soon as we see it in fantasy, it becomes codified and popularized in a way. And then it enters into these computer games, or it enters into these role-playing games. And then from that, we have the Forgotten Realms books, the Dragonlance books, the Ravenloft books, which are kind of horror fantasy. But then we have the people who read that, and then they wrote books.
Right.
And they're appealing to an audience that likes that, so they start adding those things in. So David Eddings is a great example of this. Eddings didn't play computer games. Eddings didn't play role-playing games. Eddings was rather dismissive of Tolkien. He said he was going back to the classics to write his YA series, The Belgariad.
Right.
But in it, you have the sandy-haired, blue-eyed farm boy goes on a quest with the immortal sorcerer who's the leader of the group, Belgarath. Then you have the short acrobatic thief who has daggers. You have the knight in full armor who's full on 19th century these and thous. Or sorry, full on like pseudo medieval romance. You have the archer. You have the guy who's a brilliant cavalry horse lord. Like each one again has their one particular thing, and their physical. He has one of them's a Viking who's like 6'7" and is a stereotypical Viking walking around. It's this mishmash of these readily identifiable stereotypes, and yet they all conform to a fantasy role, a fantasy character, a fantasy function. And as we go across the series, each time there's one thing happens, and it's we need to. Oh, look, it's lucky we have so and so for this because they're the perfect person to be able to do this.
They know exactly how to. Yeah.
And again, it follows that very, I would say, blunt, very blunt. This is a narrative puzzle that has been designed so that this character can show off who they are. I loved the Eddings books when I was a kid. I think they're very useful to study.
Okay.
I wouldn't necessarily recommend them, and that has nothing to do with the controversy and elements of his background, which we're not getting into. But so when you think of genre now that we've been talking,
Right.
how do you feel about genre?
I feel it's sort of a conversational tool, I guess. Like you said, the shorthand tool. It's a sort of a label maker for conversations, just to make sure we're all on the same page. Um, yeah.
And this is one of the fascinating things. When people have said to me in the past that they really liked George R. R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire, could I recommend a book that they might like? A lot of the books I would recommend are historical fiction.
Sure. Yeah.
Rather than fantasy. So even though like Song of Ice and Fire, Grimdark, and a lot of the focus of that series, the things that are going on in it, the things that he focuses on, the style that it's in, even the type of world that it's in. If you're a fan of A Song of Ice and Fire, then a lot of historical fiction is actually doing that, set during the medieval or even during the Renaissance or earlier. but it's focused on that style of narrative. Because if you think about it, a lot of the fantastical elements, the idea of the magic in the world, that's relatively minor in A Song of Ice and
Yeah.
Fire. Even the dragons, as important as the dragons are, but it's relatively minor to what the majority of the narrative is exploring. They're more a tool and function of the narrative rather than an element of the narrative that's being explored. And so, if we're talking about in terms of genre, yeah, it's clearly fantasy. It's clearly grimdark, to use that subgenre. But the narrative elements in it, much like I was saying earlier with Reacher, if someone is entertained by that style of narrative, I'd be more likely to actually recommend historical fiction.
Right. They might not really be looking for another book with White Walkers, or they might not be looking for a book with dragons. Like,
And
yeah,
it's the same when people talk about I've read Wheel of Time. What other fantasy series should I read? So they're already locking onto the fact they read Wheel of Time. Wheel of Time is a series, therefore the next thing they want to read is a
fantasy
series.
series. Yeah.
What about the Wheel of Time did you like? Did you like the gender politics of it? Did you like the magic of it? Did you like the politics of it? Did you like the episodic nature of it? Did you like the earlier books more and the later books less? Did you like the later books more and the earlier books less? Because again, there's a different focus and a different style being a book. And if we better understand the elements that someone is drawing forth, what they are seeing at the heart of that fuzzy set that they are creating,
Right.
we are better able to match text to it. Because if we say it's epic fantasy, and if you like Wheel of Time and it is epic fantasy, you will like all other epic fantasy. You're like,
Yeah.
not necessarily, because there's writing style, there's a point of view, there's the style of narration, there's the events within it, there's the structure of it, there's the type of characters, there's the type of world. There are all of these elements, and simply calling it epic fantasy, while that is really useful for someone who already knows it, and it's again this sort of shorthand we use within conversation, it's actually not really that useful when it comes to identifying factors.
Yeah.
Because how we construct terms like epic fantasy or it's a fantasy series. The Dresden Files is a fantasy series. So someone's read Wheel of Time. Oh yeah, well if you've read Wheel of Time and really liked it, you must like the Dresden Files and you must like the Anita Blake series and you must also like Harry Potter.
Right. And Fourth Wing.
And Fourth Wing. And even when we say series, are we making a distinction between a trilogy, which is a specific narrative structure, and series, or serial? Because again, series and serial are different.
Right.
So what do we mean? What are we looking at? And people say, but we don't need to be that nitty gritty. We don't need that. And yes, when we're in conversation with our friends, when we're in conversation with people who know us, when we're in conversation with people who know the thing that we're talking about, then when we use a lot of these terms, they're backfilling the connotations. They're backfilling the meaning. But the one thing we always have to be aware of, just because we have used that term, they do not necessarily think and define that term the same way that we do. And what we have picked up on it, again, like the Malazan Book of the Fallen. If someone really likes the Malazan Book of the Fallen, what else would you recommend? Well, the novels of the Malazan Empire, obviously, because it's within the same world. And there are similar styles. But would you recommend R. Scott Baker's what was it? The Darkness.
Second Apocalypse.
Second Apocalypse. Well, it depends. If they're looking for that darker tone and almost a deconstruction of epic fantasy and a particular style, but you go, oh, well, it's a brilliant, long, complicated series with a lot of depth, and you go, oh, well, Johnny Wirtz.
Right.
The Wars of Light and Shadow. Sorry, I'm just looking at my bookshelves that are hidden behind the background. And yet some people would look at it and go, why would you recommend Johnny Wirtz if they like Malazan? Or other people saying, why would you recommend R. Scott Baker, given that it's this deconstruction of religion and philosophy taken to a literal and exaggerated level, And it is so dark and bleak at times and so brutal that Malazan, with its heart of exploration of compassion and point of view, they seem radically different in that sort of style. And yet, obviously, there are links between the two. If people really like Malazan, why would you recommend Johnny Worts? Because it's in a very different style and it's. But again, there are links between it. It's not just that they are both series. It's not just that they're both epics. It's sometimes what they're exploring and how they're exploring it. If someone really likes Brandon Sanderson's the
Like Mistborn or
no
Stormlight.
the Stormlight
Stormlight, yeah.
arc, you know, there's a whole load of books like Wheel of Time.
Right,
If you
right.
like Stormlight Archive, the chances are you're probably going to
Right.
like Wheel of Time because it's pitched at a similar literary level. It has inherent plot contradictions and things going on. It has that explanation of the world building and the explanation of magic and exploration of magic within the world. And there's a quite a significant overlap between those two things. But if you're interested in Wheel of Time because of the Aes Sedai and the politics in the Tar, then maybe the Stormlight Archives are not really going to be your thing because that's not the focus of that story. And that's why epic fantasy, yeah, it's a brilliant catch-all category for certain things, but it's more complicated than that. And I think when it comes to genre, the worst mistake that we can make is be prescriptive because our definition of that genre is not necessarily the same as anyone else's. And genres are simply an expression and collection of like with like. And there are so many different ways for texts to be like one another. And it all depends on what you're comparing and contrasting. Is the Lord of the Rings like the Malazan Book of the Fallen? Well, the Lord of the Rings is more like the Malazan Book of the Fallen than it is the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn.
Right, right.
But
Yeah.
you know, it all depends on what we're comparing and contrasting, the elements that we're taking out of it. But anyway,
How a question about a specific genre. How do you feel about the magical realism label and that sort of subgenre?
well, magical realism because it came from art.
Okay, yeah.
And then it got translated over, and it was quite specifically for a while located in Latin America,
Right, right.
South and Central America, and a particular type of storytelling there. And you know, if we were being very limited in the definition, it would be that type of story from those authors of that time period. Much like we can talk about modernist writers or postmodernist writers or Victorian writers, that we're pinpointing a particular movement. But then someone can take that style of storytelling and write it in the modern day. And they may not be from that background. They may not be from that area. They may not be from that culture. They may be writing in a completely different language. But they take that style of storytelling. So what are we doing with the label? Is the label so that we can readily identify the magic realists? Or is it to identify the style of the story, the style of the narrative? And again, magic realism, like all genres and subgenres, has evolved over time. And in no way should that diminish the importance of the earlier works. In no way should that diminish those works that sort of set up this foundation. But just as we talk about epic fantasy or grimdark, the early works may have helped establish and codify this approach. But then it's explored and expanded in different ways. And there's a rise and fall of popularity like any genre. But yes, the early works are important and they're a great way to see what it led to. Lord of the Rings, perfect example of this. If we didn't have Lord of the Rings, the number of secondary world epic fantasies with quests would be greatly diminished. Tolkien established it, even though Tolkien's Middle Earth is not really a secondary world, even though the quest is not the model of quest that we typically use, even though the quest party is not the model of the party that we typically use. But so much of that has developed because of Tolkien. So Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, really important text. Is it revelatory about the modern genre, modern epic fantasy or modern quest fantasy? Not really. you can there are much better paradigms to explain the modern genre than Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. But if you want to understand the evolution of it, of course it's important. So when we think about the magic realists and when we think about what they were doing, this playfulness, there's a lot of overlap with modernism and then slipping into postmodernism in this almost deconstruction of reality, deconstruction on questioning of accepted practices and accepted beliefs and the strength and rationality of beliefs, but also the blending of what quite often we would consider like fairy tale or
Right,
fantastical
right.
elements. So it's a cultural movement and a style of writing that had a particular geographical and cultural beginnings, but now as a label is able to be, and I shouldn't think people should be ashamed of this anyway, of being applied to things outside of that
Yeah.
because um, it's carrying on a tradition that was established. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Because, and even then, the elements of magic realism are not only found there. They're found throughout different storytelling. Where quite often you have like someone, it's a perfectly normal situation, and then oh yeah, and then the fairy with or the angel with the large wings walks through and gets a glass of water and walks off.
Mhm.
And it's not remarked upon. What's the distinction between that and an immersive fantasy world? You go, oh well, because the perception of the magic realist is that it is a mimetic reality, but it's distending or distorting or investigating that mimetic reality, as opposed to an immersive fantasy where no, this is a secondary world.
Right.
The rules are different. But we look at things like Blood in the Mist or even some of China Mieville's short stories that they have a magic realist bent. They're in the style of magic realism just because they're not from Latin America or South or
Right,
Central
right, right.
America, that they're not from those cultures or exploring it in exactly the same way. It doesn't stop them being magic realist stories. And again, when we're using the term, we're trying to describe what the thing is so that people know what we're talking about, as opposed to summarizing and paraphrasing the story, the plot, the characters, the style, and going into a long critique.
Yeah.
We're trying to use that shorthand, that bumper sticker, that little tag to go, well, this is the thing I'm talking about. But it never, and I always think we have to be careful that we should never denigrate or forget the importance of those texts and those authors and those writers and those artists who were early creators of this form. The form gained popularity and views and imitators who adopted it and developed it in new and different ways. That understanding that I think is very important. That's why I would never denigrate Tolkien. I might make flippant and facetious comments at times, but I have enormous respect for Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings and the importance of Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings to the genre. But that doesn't mean I go, oh, it's an absolutely perfect book. Like
Right.
it's just as you're just as able to criticize it as any other work. And the other thing is what Tolkien did and how it's been adapted and changed over time. You go, yes, it's an important work, but it's no longer the seminal work to look at to understand the genre. Um, because otherwise, well, why not go and look at Pilgrim's Progress or Dante's Inferno or Paradise Lost
Mhm.
or the Odyssey, the Iliad?
Right.
Like, how far back do we need to go to go? But this is the text that, oh well, because Tolkien set off that cultural phenomenon. Yeah, but I can find all of the elements that were in Tolkien in earlier
Right.
works. Le Morte d'Arthur.
Yeah.
Like the number of people who say, "Oh, like Tolkien was writing a mythology for England because they didn't have one," and you go, "King Arthur."
Yeah.
Like, how many times does that story have to be adapted for you to realize that that's not what he was saying? Oh,
I had a this is relayed to me secondhand, but my advisor in my undergrad history program told me he had a student the previous year who was trying to write his final thesis about the history of King Arthur, and that story. Yeah.
God, it's complicated.
Yeah.
Because you had like Credit Trois, you have Mallory, you have the was it the book of some of like the really early stuff, and not the Encyclopedia Britannica, but there was, like all of these historical texts and pseudo historical texts,
Right,
and
right. And it's
yeah.
like, well,
And then when you get the influence of medieval romance on it in Credit Trois and how he radically changes a bunch of things and invents a whole bunch of things. Like people say, oh yeah, like the Knights of the Round Table, like Lancelot. You know, Lancelot was a Johnny come lately. You know, like go back to the original. Sorry, I had to do it, the
yeah,
original
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Welsh
yeah, yeah,
myths,
yeah.
and even then, those are some of the Welsh myths that were written down that were variants of other Welsh myths and other Celtic myths, um, and even when they were written down and adapted and retold and merged, at what point does it become its new own original thing? And like the history of King Arthur and Arthurian legend, like even the Grail quest, the whole quest for the Holy Grail, like that you go, yeah, but that had to be post Crusade.
Right, right.
You know, we were going on the Grail quest a while before the Crusade.
Right, right.
You know, and you're
They
right
knew
up.
it was coming. It's just
What are we doing tomorrow? Grail quest. I see. Looked into the future with the Magic
right.
8 Ball.
They said Grail Quest. Where's that gonna be? Who knows? But we're gonna go that way.
And you're like, but looking at that, an influence to go back to Wheel of Time, the San Angreal. And
Oh yeah, yeah,
so Angreal, the whole idea of the Grail, the powerful object.
yeah,
You know, that's one of the big influences on the Wheel of Time. And Arthur Hawkwing. You're
yeah,
like,
yeah,
oh really?
yeah.
Uh, and that's fine. Like having these influences, and Jordan like wove them into his story, which is great. And I love picking that sort of stuff up. But you know, people get very annoyed. Oh, Jordan didn't do that. It was all wholly original. Oh God.
Yeah. Yeah. There was something I had something on the tip of my tongue. With something with Malazan, but I completely
Like a Chain Chamal,
Oh, maybe if you
and how can you have science fictional dinosaurs with swords for
for arms,
arms
yeah.
also be alien spaceship makers?
Right, right. Light
Like,
spoilers, Malazan, for but
no, it just sounds
it's
like too much
very
to do.
out of context. Yeah.
But why not?
Right, right.
But what's where is the rule that says that fantasy must be medieval, pseudo-medieval, Renaissance, pseudo-Renaissance, or ancient? Like, where are these divisions coming from? And it's alien creatures. Oh, you can't have aliens in fantasy. Why
Right.
not? The Stormlight Archives. No one would dispute that the Stormlight Archives is an epic fantasy series. But they're different planets. And
Right,
people from a
right.
different planet are clearly aliens.
Right. And travel between, or at least one or two, are travel between the
And you
different
go, so there are
series.
aliens and planets. So this is science fiction. This isn't fantasy. And you can see then this idea of this only belongs in
Right, right.
and becoming prescriptive, and then that territorial marking to define and pin down. Instead of saying, well, yeah, traveling between different planets is typically more science fictional than it is fantastical. But when you look at John Carter of Mars, he magically teleports to Mars. And yeah, somehow like his strength and his ability to jump and the lesser gravity on Mars, like that makes sense. But then they have weird technology and he's on a different planet. And you're like, okay, so it's science fiction. Um, does it matter?
No, yeah.
Because when we then try to identify the elements, you go, what does it read more like? What when we put it at the center of a fuzzy set, what are the elements that we're saying it's like? What are the other books that it is like, the other narratives, the other films, the other TV shows? Because if there's a preponderance of them that are all in a certain style and all have a certain thing, you might go, well, okay, it fits better over there than it does over here. Rather than it says, because of this one thing or these five things, it must be. So to go back then to Star Wars, as again, a great example of this. When people look at Star Wars, when people want more stories like Star Wars. It's action, it's adventure, and it's that quite often the science fiction gloss. That's a big attraction to it, even though the narrative elements are far more folklore and fairy tale and fantasy. A lot because film is such a visual medium that the impact of that science fictional world building, the story world being science fictional and looking that way, that quite often skews it toward science fiction because that's the impression that we get. That Obi-Wan Kenobi isn't a wizard, he's a Jedi.
Mm-hmm.
It isn't a magic sword, it's a laser sword.
Right.
So, like, yeah, I know it's lightsaber, but it's not a magic sword. The Princess Leia, well, she's not some princess trapped in a tower. She's a senator trapped in a Death Star.
Right.
You're like, okay. And Darth Vader, he's not the evil Dark Lord, he's this scary guy in an Imperial army.
With a technical breathing apparatus.
Yeah. But we can see how all those elements could very easily be described in fantastical terms. And yet, the more natural way to talk about Star Wars, the more natural way to think about Star Wars, is science fiction. And people get very upset. They go, oh no, it's science fantasy, because it is this blend. And okay, but you can highlight that. And that's not the issue. It's what is the best term to use to convey what we mean to our audience? What are they going to understand about it? Because if I refer to Star Wars as fantasy, people get really bent out of shape because, well, fantasy doesn't have lasers. Fantasy doesn't have, because they're not thinking about it in narrative terms. If I describe it as science fiction, you go, oh, well, and you'll always have, like, again, people like me going, but he's a space wizard.
Right.
And then people go, that middle ground, science fantasy. And you're like, yeah, whatever. But it's know your audience, know what you're trying to communicate and why you're trying to communicate that. Because when we think of the nature of, say, the Star Wars story world, Andor is radically different to the Star Wars movies. Andor is a modern day, gritty, spy, espionage, thriller kind of thing. And looking at it, it's more like John le Carre's sort of writing than it is Robert Ludlum. It's not Jason Bourne. It's more like these people are depressed and broken and do really bad things because they're in a bad situation. That's what Andor is. And it's radically different in story time. The one similarity is it's set within the same story world, but the type of narrative is radically different to the rest of Star Wars. Ewok's Caravan of Courage, radically different to the rest of Star Wars, but set in the same narrative story world. And that's the beauty of these things, that we can look at how it's being expressed, we can look at what's being expressed, we can look at why it's being expressed, and what's being explored. Like, all of these are different elements that we can use to construct our definition of the thing.
Yeah.
Because we're finding things that explain and describe. We are not prescribing what it should be.
Right.
We're describing what it is. Takes us back to the very beginning of this.
Yeah. And I don't want to go too long or keep you too long, but maybe one more question along that prescription divide. Do you think publishers and production companies, do you think they're having any, I guess through like market demand and these forces, are they having an impact on like limiting artists' creativity? Like, are they like limiting the sort of imagination? Like, obviously Tor, they market Malazan as an epic fantasy, and I think that makes total sense. But there's some authors and series out there where I'm sure they're not exactly pleased with how their book is being.
But there are a couple of different questions here.
Yes,
wrapped up in
yeah.
Well, at least to my mind.
Yeah.
So let's start with the idea of genre as a commercial category.
Mm-hmm.
so to sell stuff.
Right.
So if you are publishing a book and you think your book, X book before this was really popular, the book that you're about to publish, you think will sell well to that crowd. So you want to market it the same way. You want to connect it in some way. And then, you see that blurb, the new Song of Ice and Fire, or the new Fourth Wing, or the Romantasy as it should have been done. And whatever the little tagline is, the blurb on the back, the different authors that have recommended it, the comparison books that they've used. But if you know that your audience is a certain core audience and you want to appeal to them, then you want to tag that book with that so it appears in that section so that your audience can discover it.
Right.
So that's why, fantasy and science fiction in a lot of respects can be radically different. And yet the majority of times when you go into a bookstore, it's the fantasy and science fiction section.
Yeah, sure.
But, you have someone reading Greg Egan's hard SF. They're not as likely to enjoy Fourth Wing.
Right.
Why are they in the same section? They're radically different.
Right.
But at the same time, there will be people who love Greg Egan's hard SF, but also love Fourth Wing. Like, no problem with that. But it's using it not just as a categorization system, but as a marketing system. So if you have a choice of 3 books in front of you, and someone said, you're allowed to choose one of these books, you can look at them, you can look at the covers, you can look at the back, you can have a quick look at the first couple of pages, and it's relatively easy. In a couple of minutes, you can go, well, this is the one I'm more likely to like out of these 3 books. If you had 30 books in front of you, it becomes a lot more difficult, particularly if there's no sort of rhyme or reason why these 30 books are here.
Right.
The Adventures of Huck Finn, The Lord of the Rings, Lonesome Dove, American Psycho.
Right. It's not like there's a 10-book series and you would clearly eliminate 9 of those because
yeah. So like Pride and Prejudice, Lonesome Dove, American Psycho, The Lord of the Rings. Like, let's say those are the ones that you're like, oh well, what am I looking at? And because of the greater selection, it becomes more difficult. Now there's 100 books in front of you, and they're not organized in any way. Well, if you organize them into like with like, the fuzzy set, literary Venn diagram, the idea of genres and subgenres, and you put like with like, you might go, well, I'm more in the mood for something funny. And I also enjoy things with magic in them. Discworld.
Right.
Fantastic. I quite like the witty kind of fantastical, but more like fairy tale, but with a slightly absurdist. Was it the Thursday Next series?
I don't think I'm familiar.
They might go for that, or you might. Well, I'm looking for something that it's militaristic, and again, like a lot of people describe Malazan as military fantasy.
Right.
But is that accurate? Well, a lot of us would say no. You look at the Black
Parts
Company.
of it, yeah.
The Black Company, is that military fantasy? Well, it's about a military unit of mercenaries, but it's not really about military campaigns in the same way, but it kind of is. So again, it's how we're defining it. But the greater the selection, the greater the number, the more necessary it is to find some way to group them to make it manageable. And then when we think of purchasing books online, or even purchasing books in a physical bookstore, you walk in, and if those weren't organized into westerns, science fiction and fantasy, romance, graphic novel, like, if you just walked in and it was random, or even alphabetically by author, it's not random anymore.
Right.
It's alphabetically by author. I guarantee you the sales in that place would go down because no one would ever be able to find anything. And so genre as a way to market things, to sell things, to help people find things, that's one of the really useful tools. But that's using genre in a very different way. So publishers have always been aware of this. If you like that book, you might like this.
Right.
And if you're starting on a one-to-one comparison, that's fine. But now if you're trying to go, well, actually, I want to market to a group, and so it's not necessarily about one book within it. It's a style of book. Now, you were talking about, does it limit artistic freedom and expression? Publishers are always a commercial entity. They are in the business of making money. Right. They want to sell the things that the public wants. They want to meet market demand. So in some respects, they are more likely to focus on the things that they are going to think generates a better return of investment, a
Right.
better return of their time. So if something is rising in popularity and there's another book that's like it, they're hoping for the same popularity. Take Harry Potter. The number of books that came out after Harry Potter that were trying to be the next Harry Potter. That's not to say that books like Harry Potter didn't exist beforehand. They did. The Switch series, the books of Magic by Neil Gaiman,
Wizard of Earthsea a little, yeah.
parts of the Wizard of Earthsea.
Yeah.
But the idea of a magic, like this is not new, but it became hugely popular and therefore spawned imitators. Now, those were people who had been inspired by it and wanted to write their own way of doing it. Lev Grossman's The Magicians. As about as far away as from Harry Potter as you can get while still being about a magic school. But and it was even described at the time as grown up Harry Potter. And a lot of people who loved Harry Potter bought like the first book of the Magicians and went,
what?
This isn't what I thought it was. Because again, yeah, there's a magic school. Yes, but someone going to surface level similarities, but trying to sell it. So you have the inspiration. People read this, they loved it, and they want to write their version of not of that specific thing, but they want to write their story that's like that, that's achieving those same feelings, that's achieving those same effects, or the way that they would have told that kind of story.
Right.
So it's an inspiration. But then you have other people who go, this is where the market's going, this is where the trend is, and this is a job for me. So I'm going to write to what the market wants. That you can make a very successful career out of that. I think you're less likely to write rewarding stories because you're not writing the story that you want. You're writing to a perceived market demand.
Right.
And that it's a very useful skill, don't get me wrong, and you can make a very successful living out of it. But a lot of people write because there's certain stories they want to tell and they want to tell them in a particular way. And what they're hoping is that they find an audience with which that narrative resonates. And then not only that, that audience isn't just one or two people, but several million people. That's the hope that something in the narrative that you've created is going to speak to a really large group of people. So they all buy it, they all say it's amazing, and you make millions of dollars. But the point is, you're not trying to write to what you think the 2 million people want to read. You're trying to write the best story possible so that it actually resonates with that many people. So it's focusing on the story and hoping that's the impact it will have. But as a publisher, you might be willing to take a risk on some books like that.
Right.
But ultimately, and a lot of the publishers are owned, they're big corporations and so they're looking at the bottom line and go, well, this one's going to generate the return and that's what we need and it's going to cover our overhead. So we'll do 10 books that we are almost guaranteed are going to make X amount of money and we'll gamble on one. Once that system's in place, that does limit the breadth of the texts that come out because there are fewer spots for experimental novels, for different novels. Publishers might become more risk averse and therefore want to only bet on what they think is the sure thing. And so it's not necessarily that genre is defining and limiting the authors, but the nature of the publishing industry can have that chilling effect because a number of the imprints are not necessarily as willing to take the risk. We see it also in TV.
Sure.
Taking a risk on a TV show. It's a huge investment of money. And if it pays off, brilliant. But if you don't immediately recoup that investment, like think of the number of TV shows that Netflix cancels within 2 seasons.
Yeah.
Or the number of TV shows that get a pilot made, but then no further.
Yeah.
That quite often, a lot of TV shows these days are not generating fast enough returns.
Right.
Because of that, they're getting cut off. You go back 40 years and you look at network TV where there was advertising, where there were sponsorships, where there were syndication rights, where there were residuals. where maybe the first season was okay, and then the second season picked up a bit. The third season, they found their stride. And back in the day, that was perfectly normal. No, that's not to say that there weren't sometimes a pilot and it never got made, or that shows got cancelled after one season. That still happened too. But a lot of the time, shows took a while to find their footing. Or the first season was awesome, and then the next four seasons were all varying levels of terrible in varying different ways. There are all sorts of, like, the history of TV is messy. But with streaming, suddenly it's, well, how many new viewers did we attract? And that's a really weird metric because we do not have an infinitely expanding population of infinitely expanding numbers of people who are going to subscribe. We've kind of reached such, like, the impact streaming's had on TV is terrible, in a lot of respects.
Yeah.
But to go back to the question about narrative, okay, so Game of Thrones was really, really popular. But Game of Thrones basically only got made because HBO's Rome got made first.
Oh, I love that show. Yeah.
And the first season was brilliant. The second season, because of what they're trying to cover, it's in two very distinct halves.
Condense it,
and it didn't flow as well, whereas the first season was brilliant. But I don't think you would have had a Game of Thrones without HBO already having tried Rome with the BBC. And again, it's historical fiction.
Right.
It's a period drama. It had military elements. It's about the politics. It had a lot of the sex and violence. Like a lot of the things.
Like grim.
A lot of the things that a Game of Thrones became synonymous with. And you go, but HBO's and BBC's Rome did it first. And they had that high level production value. But again, it only ran for 2 seasons. The whole Roman history to play with. It could have gone. You had Spartacus, Blood and Sand, and all of the different Spartacus seasons. And they were on Stars as the network, never had the budget. They focused very heavily on the sex and violence. And while there were excellent episodes and some excellent storytelling, it just never reached the audience because the very overt sex and violence. Like it was going for an R rating most of the time. HBO's Rome, it had those things, but it wasn't quite as, it was adult, but it wasn't explicit. So there are all of these different things that when we look at influencing, and it's very rarely as simple as, well, Game of Thrones was amazing. A Song of Ice and Fire, when a Game of Thrones book first came out, it did well, but it wasn't the phenomenon happened because of the TV show. And even then, it was the TV show had been running, I think, for a full season before it started to build up the steam in the fall. But looking back at it now, we see it as this phenomenon. Same with Harry Potter. Everyone, oh yeah, but Harry Potter was a phenomenon. Not when the first book came out. The first book, it wasn't, oh my God, Harry Potter's taking over the world. It took time and it reached a tipping point. Once it hit that tipping point, then suddenly it was a phenomenon. And no one can predict that. And so that's why I think writing to the market is about, you never know, by the time it takes you to write it, get it to someone, get it published, the market may have moved on.
Right.
Or it might not have. Or people might go, but this is too similar to. They wanted something a bit different. You never know. So writing to genre is easy because, as we talked, genre is very flexible. But writing to a specific market niche, that can be highly profitable if you're lucky. But again, if you're unlucky, it just joins the rest of it. Because we talk about the Tolkien imitators, and like obviously the most famous ones, Terry Brooks' Sword of Shannara, and Robert Jordan's The Eye of the World. These are the 2 most famous Tolkien imitations. When we look at Donaldson's The Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, highly inspired by Tolkien, but not doing something so radically different.
Very clear points of deviation,
Whereas with Brooks and Jordan, you can see it's very much seem to trying to tie into the same vein,
Yeah.
to evoke the same things, to have that same familiarity, whereas Donaldson is trying to defamiliarize.
Right.
But when we talk about Tolkien imitators, can you name five others?
I mean, well, we talked a little about Eddings, but even you mentioned that he wasn't trying to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, but Eddings,
Yeah.
Eddings Belgariad shared very little apart from starting in a rural community and then going. But apart
Right,
from
right.
that, like, that's not really similarity to Tolkien. That's similarity to quest narrative. That's
Right,
similarity to
right,
fairy tale.
right. Two, each person has their role, unlike
And
why are there four hobbits?
and yet, when people talk about Tolkien imitators, it's this idea that there are thousands of them, and there are indeed thousands of them. But when you ask people for specific examples, quite often
Yeah.
it'll come down to Robert Jordan and Terry
Terry
Brooks,
Brooks, yeah.
because they're the most famous ones, and they're the ones that are readily identifiable. But there's a whole lot of works that were heavily inspired by Tolkien. Like, you can look at a lot of the Forgotten Realms and Dragonlance books,
Sure.
where there is a heavy influence of Tolkien, but they're trying to do it within a ludic environment, a game world. And it's different, but you can see them. Oh, we're going on the, and we're going down into the dark underground city, and you're like, the Mines of Moria, perhaps.
Yeah.
And of course, Jordan didn't do that. He just went into the abandoned city that was haunted by an ancient evil. That
Right,
it
right.
wasn't underground; it was above ground, and that makes it radically different to Moria being inhabited by a Balrog,
Right.
because reasons. Um, and that's the thing. It's we can see a lot of these similarities, and it's the congruence of them is the things that we group together. But so many people will talk about Tolkien having this heavy influence and people copying Tolkien, and yet, and Tolkien having this impact on the genre and people writing Tolkien-esque fantasy. But there are far fewer outright Tolkien imitators than I think people realize.
Okay, yeah.
And even then, with that, a lot of them were bringing their own approach. They were leaning more into sword and sorcery. They were leaning more into action. They were leaning more into YA. They were leaning more. Each time, they were bringing their own thing to it and trying to write a Tolkien-esque fantasy. What do you mean by Tolkien-esque? Does it have to have hobbits? Well, no. Okay, so there's no hobbits. Does it have to have a wise old mage guiding a quest group? Well, no, I'm not going to do that. Then why is it Tolkien-esque? Oh,
The lore, the language,
it's
yeah.
because I've spent 105 years creating the world
Right.
and writing up these notes.
Right.
That Alan Moore does that for
Right,
like the
right.
stuff that he writes. So what makes it Tolkien-esque?
Right.
And when you start trying to pinpoint it, that's, quite often we go, oh, hang on a sec. Because we start identifying elements and think, well, is that unique to Tolkien? And no, it's not. A lot of what Tolkien did was consolidating them in one particular narrative that became wildly popular. So those ideas became associated with him, even though, yeah, they are throughout
Everywhere.
lots of
Yeah,
other stories. And that's understanding influence and understanding how these key texts are not necessarily the things that created, but they are things that come to encapsulate or eloquently reflect the concepts in one package, all in one place. And again, that's why I think like David Eddings' Belgariad is a very useful, easy to read text to show a bunch of what actually seems to be more associated with RPGs, even though he had nothing to do with RPGs. But that was a lot of the style of storytelling that was going around. That's how RPGs distilled Tolkien into a form that was more commercially palatable for a lot of different people. That seems to be what is being articulated in Eddings, even if that's not where he got it from. But he was understanding it in the same way. So it puts it in one place. And that's why the studying of what D&D and AD&D were, and looking at how they did things and what they explored and the franchises they spawned, looking at that, it consolidates a lot of this in one place, which makes it easier to study and understand. And it's not saying they invented it, because it's almost never they invented it. Like, name one thing that Tolkien invented,
Right.
because orcs come from a variant of mythology that
Yeah,
he
sure.
changed. He didn't certainly didn't invent elves. Like Dunsany's the king of Elfin's daughter is sitting there going, "Hello, am I invisible?" Um, he didn't invent wizards. He didn't invent magic rings. He didn't invent like maybe we could say halflings, except we see variants of halflings and dwarves in various mythologies.
Right, right.
They, but is that saying that Tolkien didn't? No, he created the Lord of the Rings. Like he created this thing, which took all of these different elements and put it in one place. That created this complete package that at that time was challenging a status quo, was challenging the way that people looked at it. It wasn't for children the way that The Hobbit was. This was an adult work. And that was a bit different. It wasn't a fairy tale. It wasn't a folk tale. It codified something that now has become the genre of fantasy. And that is something I find fascinating.
I love anything that sort of destabilizes a like what so much of the conversation considers a starting point or a, a key text or something like that. Anything that sort of, or any argument that sort of repositions maybe the timeline of the history, how we kind of implot the history of fantasy. I just really like not thinking of it almost frees up Tolkien to be studied like just any of these other
And
fantasy books.
when we think about it, when we look at ancient mythology, obviously ancient mythology used to be ancient religion. So there's a
Right,
certain point
right.
where religion becomes mythology. Where's that point? And then that mythology, when does that mythology go from being mythology to a fantasy story? Where's that exact point?
And where's the point where there's a this gets into sort of an uncomfortable area where there could be a sort of disrespect to certain cultures, depending on how we talk about different cultures. What's their religion? What's their myth? What's their
Because, well, think about it this way,
yeah.
and it was a point that I think Kevin Smith made in the film Dogma, and they're speaking about Christianity, and he goes, "Oh, Christian mythology," and he goes, "God hates it when you refer to it as a
As
mythology."
mythology.
But and you go, oh well, but ancient Greek mythology. You go, but that was religion. So if someone from that time period was standing there and you refer to their religion as mythology, it is analogous to someone saying to a Christian mythology. And that can be hard for us to wrap our heads around. But even then, what's the and folklorists and fairy tale specialists, there's a difference and a distinction between folklore and fairy tale. For the vast majority of our discussions, we lump the two of them together. And there are friends of mine who are specialists who cringe when I do that because they're not the same and there are distinctions to be made. But if we think, when does Arthurian folklore and folktale become Arthurian myth?
Mm-hmm.
When does a legend become a myth? When does a myth become a legend? When is the historical event the true thing and then the story about it a different thing? Um, the and what about the original? We saw this with Snow White. People talking about the original Snow White,
Oh
and
yeah,
you're like,
yeah, yeah. Wait
what
a
you mean?
second.
The Brothers Grimm variant,
Right.
where they took multiple versions of a folk tale that existed in
Mm-hmm.
multiple different versions, and they rewrote it to emphasize the Protestant work ethic
Right,
and
right.
and wrote in their contemporary politics as a didactic narrative for people. But yeah,
Yeah.
you can't put modern politics. You go, but they did. They put in their modern politics. But
And I mean, with like the kind of the whole idea of our conversation defining genre, if someone were to say the new Snow White is, uh, I don't know what they would say, is disrespectful or is, which is even weird to say one work of art is disrespectful of another work of art. Kind of an odd phrase to use. But this recent film does a poor job building off of the original. If all that person would have to do is frame their discussion in the context of film history, be very specific that they're comparing just these two versions of an older story. And then I'd be like, okay, this is
Yeah.
okay. I see where you're coming
But
from. This,
for instance,
yeah.
like one of my favorite ones to talk about, Jane Austen's Emma
Mhm.
and Clueless.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Clueless, fantastic adaptation of Jane Austen's Emma.
It's hilarious.
So
Yeah.
gets updated to the at that stage, the modern day. Sort of goes, well, this is more about teenagers in high school rather than high society to make it more relevant. They turned it into a teen drama comedy. They updated the language, they updated the characters, they race swapped
Yeah.
characters, they gender swapped characters, that they updated everything. But it is an adaptation of Jane Austen's Emma. And people, oh yeah, but they give it a different name. Right, but it's still an adaptation. Yeah, but they give it a different name, so I didn't think it was going to be Emma. But okay, but it's still an adaptation of Emma. Like, yes. So in an adaptation, you're allowed to change the setting, the time period, the dialogue, the sequence of events, the type of events, the characters, what the characters wearing. Like, you can change all those things and still be a great adaptation. Yes. Right, okay. We're in firm agreement. Forbidden Planet as the Tempest.
Right.
Shakespeare would be rolling in his grave about how they disrespected his text. It's an they took
Right.
Shakespeare's text, they updated the language for the modern audience. They transplanted the story from that island to a planet and gave it a science fictional code. But Forbidden Planet is an adaptation of The Tempest. 10 Things I Hate About You, Taming of the Shrew. Again, you know, there was this whole spate we had of Shakespeare adaptations in the modern day.
O was the Othello one.
And She's All That.
Oh, yeah.
Twelfth
Night, yeah.
So there were a bunch of these. But in each of these, you know, the setting and stuff, these were changed for a modern audience, a new audience for the thing, not just fans of the original. That's not disrespecting the original. That's, I want to take this story and give it to, and even then, Shakespeare stole almost all of his stories from people.
Right. And co-wrote, and it was, I think, like, it was a lot more like a writer's room of a TV show for Shakespeare than it was like when we think about an author sitting down in a quiet study
in a garret.
Right.
Uh-huh.
Like it was totally collaborative. And I'm sure even the ways that the plays were performed back in the 1590s, they varied performance to performance. So maybe he was rolling in his grave about one of those performances. I don't know, but
when we then think of adaptations, and again, if we are looking forward to an adaptation and we have in our mind our experience of the narrative, what we got out of the narrative, and we go, that's what I want to see. You go, okay, that's your expectation and your preference. Right. And if the showrunner and the writers and the directors and the actors aren't doing that, that doesn't necessarily make it a bad adaptation, because adaptations necessarily change things, and they'll change things for the audience. Well, why do that? Like, but that's what adaptations do. Because if they didn't need to change, it would just be going to the same audience. And most adaptations, one of the reasons why Hollywood and TV production companies, they like using adaptations, because there is a pre-built fan base, and they're hoping that at least some of those fans will be excited about the project, will create buzz about the project, and will engage in the project and spread word about it. Right. But all of them know that actually a lot of the fans are not going to like it, because they have to make changes. And they're going to make changes, not just to style, not just to the sequencing, not just to characters, because there are practical considerations, there are budget considerations, there are filming locations and considerations to do with the physicality of it. There are all of these sorts of things. Then there's the number of episodes
Mhm.
and the style of narration and the tone and the focus. And even then, as we said earlier, sometimes it takes actors and writers time to get into the groove of the thing. But I think we've become very needy, whiny people in the modern era.
Yeah.
This isn't doing what I want to do. Why don't they do it the way that I want to do it? They should just do it that way. But for every person saying, I saw this actually with the discussion about adapting the Malazan works. And
Mhm.
I never want to see a Malazan adaptation because it would just suck. Like, so you don't want anyone else to
To
have
see whatever,
something that they
right.
might enjoy because it's not going to do what you want.
Right.
That is so aggressively selfish.
Right.
And then it's, well, they should just adapt it as an anime in the style of Castlevania. Why? Well, I really liked the Castlevania. You're like, okay. But again, you could say, I think it would be a really interesting adaptation to that style. I'd probably really like it. But that's not what people say. They say it should be done that way.
Right.
The only way to do it justice is to do it the way that I want. And yet, that's rubbish.
Yeah.
So when we think about like all of these adaptations, again, it comes down to what we've been talking about in terms of genre, this expectation of what the thing is, and our expectation of what it should be doing and what it should be clarifying. I recently watched the second season of The Sandman, and one of my favorite issues of The Sandman is A Midsummer Night's Dream.
Oh yeah, I love that part. Yeah.
That is illustrated by Charles Vess. Yeah. And I was really quite disappointed in the adaptation.
Okay. I haven't seen season 1 or 2.
And I'm not going to spoil it for anyone.
Okay.
And part of it is there was something about how Vess illustrated it, how Vess created these things, that added a dimensionality to the characters that I was really looking forward to seeing. And because of the constraints of filming, because of the practical effects, because of all of these things, they didn't do that. And so I was disappointed. And they changed a number of the lines. They gave some of the lines to other characters because that character didn't have a whole lot to say. And so they give that line to that character because it justifies having that actor on set.
Oh, okay.
And they've already paid them for 2 lines. They might as well get 4 lines out of them. So some lines got transferred to other characters. Some of the framing of the shots was eerily reminiscent, but almost an uncanny valley of difference. And they changed some of the characters actually in how they are perceived and how we're meant to think of them as viewers. And so I was disappointed. Does that mean it was a bad adaptation? No. No. There are some really clever things that they did. There were some really interesting things that they did. Was it the comic book writ large on the screen? No. But it was clearly an adaptation of that. And they were drawing forth very specific elements that they wanted to articulate. And for a TV audience rather than a comic book audience, they were focusing on different things. And that leads to a significant difference between them. And because of that, it's not the same. In a lot of respects, it's not even close. Hence my disappointment. Because for that one in particular, because that comic was so important to my understanding of the Sandman and research that I'd done, I really wanted to see that.
Yeah.
And that's not what I saw. But it's still a good adaptation. It was still well acted. It was still well written. It was still emphasizing certain key points that fitted the thematic overview of the second season. Like it was still doing all of those things, even though it wasn't the same as the comic book. And so that's where our preferences and our preconceptions can lead us astray. We impose a framework on a narrative before we've consumed it. And if it deviates from our expectation, very easily we can end up feeling that it is bad. Even though it never said it was going to be that framework. Right. That's the thing that we created, because if we were going to do it with an unlimited budget and unlimited physical constraints, this is exactly what we would do. And yet, that's not the reality of making a film or a TV show or even an audio drama.
I feel like that's sort of a problem with TV show reception, especially the final seasons of so many shows. People typically or often will have all these critiques of those final seasons, and I wonder if part of that is how long the audience has sat with the story, how much time they've had to figure out their own best or our own best version of what we want to happen. And then by the end of it, it's like, well, that's not with a 2 hour film, it's like it goes by like that.
Yeah.
And
But an interesting thing about that, if you think Iron Man, the first Iron Man movie, if you rearrange the plot into stories, so you rearrange it chronologically, it's actually a really stereotypical, boring movie. And even then, if you did that, everyone would have detested Robert Downey Jr. and the character of Tony Stark. They would have hated the portrayal
right.
because he starts off obnoxious, arrogant, narcissistic, mean, nasty, dismissive, rude. And oh my God, you do not want to be anywhere
Right.
near this character. You're not invested in him. Because that's the whole sequence in the casino when he blows off getting the award, when he's
Right.
rude to Rhodey and all of this stuff. And so by moving that sequence later on, you start off with a sequence where it's he's being charming and witty and sophisticated
with the troops, yeah.
but his sales patter for the weapon,
Right.
and then joking around with the troops.
Yeah.
Then he gets wounded, and so we now have someone like, okay, we're not sort of going, oh, he's the greatest dude in the world, but we don't have a really negative impression of it. And then we see him get wounded, so we have sympathy for him, and we want to know what's going to find. We want to find out what's going to happen to him. And then we have the jump back in time and realize actually he's a bit of a scumbag.
Right.
But the film is about his transition to scumbag to hero.
Right. Right.
But if you'd start off with them being scumbag, it's harder to get people to invest in them becoming a hero. But by doing it, by breaking up that chronology, it makes it a lot easier to invest in it. And it's, part of an element, there's something I talk about save the cat.
Mm-hmm.
Superman flying, swooping down, getting the cat out of the tree. This person with godlike powers takes the cat out of the tree to help the little kid. And you go, in that one moment, and being nice to the kid, even though he has all of these amazing powers, we know that this is a good guy. Because of that, we're more willing to go with it. We're more willing to give them the benefit of the doubt. Because it establishes goodwill at the start. And then you can have Superman do something nasty to someone. Right. And we go, well, hang on a sec. But it's eating away at the goodwill that's been established, rather than if you start with him being nasty, then and he does something nasty, you're like, why am I watching this? Then you start questioning why you're invested. When we look at Iron Man 2 and Iron Man 3, they're basically the same movie as Iron Man 1. Like, it's just a repetition of the same thing. Disappointingly so. And because of that, we sometimes, because of the nostalgia we have about them, we kind of forget that they were very formulaic. Mm-hmm. And the major difference between the first one and the second one was that minor de-chronological, or de-syncing of the chronology. Right. That's it. That's the major distinction between them. And in each of them, let's face it, Tony's not a great guy.
Oh, yeah.
But because we have that initial goodwill, and each time he sort of ends the film doing something nice, begins and ends with Tony being a good guy. And that helps bookend it. And so, are any of the Iron Man films good adaptations of the comic book? Not really.
Right.
Like the Demon in the Bottle storyline that.
Oh, they tried in 3.
Yeah. No, in 2.
Oh, in 2. Yeah, sorry.
Part of 2. Yeah. You're like, but that's not the impact of that storyline. Even Whiplash is the villain. That's not Whiplash from the comic book. But we don't have an expectation that it's the comic book on the screen. So why did I have that expectation for the Sandman?
Yeah, is it just the stronger emotional connection to the material, or is it?
There are a couple of issues of the Sandman that I spent a lot of time studying and trying to understand and trying to deconstruct and reconstruct and play around with. So there are a couple of issues of the Sandman that mean a huge amount to me. And therefore, they are special. Because they are special, I want to see them the way that I imagine them. I want the important points of any adaptation to be the important points that I've decided. I want to see it emphasize the things that I want emphasized. I want to see it ignore the things that I don't really care about in them. But I want my version and understanding of that text to be on the screen. The difficulty is very few adaptations are ever going to do that. It would be blind luck that it just so happened that your personal interpretation coincided with their interpretation. But most of the time, it's not that. It's something different because every reader has their own interpretation. Every reader sees and interprets and understands the text slightly differently. There can be massive overlap or there can be very small overlap. Look at the number of people who read the Mendelson books and have wildly divergent opinions.
Right.
Or even people who read that and go, that's really dumb. And other people go, no, but that's awesome. You've read the same thing. How can you understand it completely differently? Because we all construct meaning in our minds. Because of that, every approach is going to be individual. And that includes anyone doing an adaptation. Because they've read the material, they've understood the material the way that they understand it, and then they're trying to construct something from it that makes sense. And that is filtered through a writer's room where you have multiple writers, all with their own spin and understanding of it. And you have someone trying to guide it. And then you have the studio execs, you have the costuming department, you have the sets, you have all of these different things. Everything feeds into it. And you see this, I think, perhaps more clearly with film. The more a film is in the sole hands of the director, where there's a single directorial vision of the narrative, it doesn't necessarily guarantee that the film will be better or worse. But what it usually guarantees is a film is more cohesive because there is a single vision for what the narrative is. But the more people involved in the committee, and film projects and TV projects are committee projects, the bigger that committee gets, the more voices and the more that singular vision can be distorted. And that's a massive impact. And so when you think of the number of people who think about genre, the number of people who have defined genre in their minds, the number of people who, well, of course, the genre is what I know and understand about it.
Right.
That's a giant committee all trying to decide what the genre is. And that leads to the dissatisfaction.
Yeah.
I think, well, at least in some sense.
Yeah, I think so. I think we might end there, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone, for watching. Please, whatever your takes on genre are, please comment down below. Maybe arguments, debates you've gotten into friends about different genres, that sort of thing. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for doing this discussion with me, Critical Dragon. Yeah. Use your official name.
Well, thank you for the conversation. It's been lovely. And I'm sorry I rambled.
No, not at all. This is perfect. Thanks.